The Cro-Mags helped inspire and create this new exciting punk scene in New York before they imploded and spent decades literally fighting each other. This is the story of revolution, aggression, and some really interesting music. This is the story of the Cro-Mags. If you end up enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe if you want. It's free. You can always unsubscribe if you're not feeling it, and you can hear more exciting stories through music history. If you want to become a member, it's like $3 a month. You get to help decide what I cover next. You get early access to the videos. Hopefully we'll be able to do some like member-only live streams, but we'll see. Maybe still isn't worth it to you, but it's up to you to decide. If you went into the lab to create the perfect version of a hardcore punk, you would probably end up with someone who had a really similar background to Harley Flanagan. Harley was born in 1967 in San Francisco, and he described his mom as a hippie and his dad as a drifter who got together at the start of San Francisco's Summer of Love. His mom, who was named Rose, was from New York, where her dad was an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. She moved to California, where she worked as a go-go dancer and got involved in the drug culture. Harley kind of talked about how she had some serious addiction issues when he was growing up and how those issues put him in not the best environments for children to be in. His dad, also named Harley, left home around the age of 14 and started riding trains. He also struggled with addiction and mostly worked as a thief or a hustler. Harley Sr. left when Harley Jr. was still quite young, so Harley remembers basically nothing about him. After a spell living with her family in New York, Harley's mom got a new boyfriend and they relocated to Europe, settling in Denmark in 1971. They essentially lived in a hippie commune over there, and Harley grew up with very little parental supervision at all. It's also where he first started learning to love music. Since it was a hippie commune, they would have a ton of shows happening in their neighborhood, in their little community, so Harley would attend those shows, and he fell in love with music, specifically live music. For Christmas one year, one of Harley's friends who was in a band stole a drum set for him and kind of like snuck into his room on Christmas Eve and set it up so Harley would have a drum set to play, and then his math teacher, who was also a jazz drummer, taught him how to start playing the drums. In 1977, his mother took a trip to London, where she walked into a record store and asked the people there, what are the kids listening to these days? They gave her a copy of Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. She took that home to Harley, who soon also got albums by bands like The Clash and fell in love with punk. He said, quote, "From there, I just tried to get my hands on anything I could. I'm hearing this nihilistic, chaotic insanity. Guys named Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten with spiky hair and dog chains. It was great." So he started going to any punk shows he could, and he even started his own punk band called Little Big Boss, where they would play a few festivals and a few gigs. They played with some of Denmark's biggest punk bands like the Sods. Throughout the years, Harley and his mom and his stepfather made several trips back to New York. They kind of bounced back and forth between New York City and Europe, but in 1979, they moved back home permanently and settled in New York, just in time to miss that first wave of CBGB punk, but just in time to be a part of something completely different. In New York, Harley picked right back up where he left off in Europe, going to punk shows and being involved in the punk community. His family settled in the Lower East Side, which at that time was not a good place to be, super chaotic. Harley described gangs kind of running the whole neighborhood. He said that he would often be attacked just for being white, so he had to learn how to defend himself and fight back. He was always just like this little ball of chaotic energy, so it wasn't hard to convince him to fight, I don't think. And he found a community with the other punk kids in the neighborhood. Howie Pyro, who was a member of several punk bands, just kind of like in that punk community, remembered, quote, "It was unheard of for people 14, 15, or 16 to be in a nightclub. Not only unheard of, but illegal. And then Harley came along way younger than us. We were pissed," end quote. Things were really chaotic in Harley's young life, from his mom and his stepfather battling their own addictions to living in the Lower East Side and all of the violence and the drugs that brought. He kind of raised himself, and he would skip class all the time, just skip school to go get drunk with his friends in the park. Eventually, he gave up on any semblance of normal life, and when he was 14, he left home and started living in squats and other abandoned buildings. He said about the dangers of his living situation, quote, "I loved it. I love a lot of things about what it was, even the danger. There was a lot of freedom in that, and it is a part of what made me. I take that with me no matter where I am. It's just in me, and I'm sure it will be till I die," end quote. One of the most important people in Harley's life was his aunt named Denise Mercedes. She grew up in Manhattan, raised by a longshoreman who played the flute and piano on the side. She saw punk shows at CBGB and fell in love, saying that punk taught her that attitude was more important than the ability to play like Jimi Hendrix. So she taught herself to play guitar and then started and joined several different punk bands. In 1978, she started a band called The Stimulators with her friends Ann and Patrick. Harley would hang out with them a lot, going to basically all of their shows and rehearsals, sometimes jamming with them when they were just kind of hanging out after rehearsals. So when their drummer, Johnny Blitz, bailed on them the day of a show, Denise asked Harley to stand in for him since he knew all the songs anyway, and that's how Harley, at 11 years old, found himself in a punk band. The Stimulators, to make a long story very short, they probably should have their own video, and maybe that'll come one day on the channel, gained a lot of popularity in the underground punk scene. I mean, they had 2 women, a homosexual lead singer, and a child. That's pretty unusual, even by punk standards. In 1980, the Stimulators went to Ireland with the intention of touring the entire UK, though that never really panned out, and that's where Harley was introduced to skinheads. This was before skinheads became super tied to racist movements. This was back when, as Harley describes it, skinheads were more about supporting a local soccer team and general hooliganism, and it was a really working class movement. He talked about his indoctrination into being a skinhead, quote, "I got my head shaved when I was in Belfast. I had been to England and been exposed to skinheads there in the 70s, but at that point I wasn't really up to the whole thing. I got into it in 1980. I had my head shaved by a guy that was a roadie for this band, The Outcasts from Belfast. The term oi hadn't really become the banner for that movement yet, so they were just a skinhead punk band." In another interview, Harley described what skinhead culture is, saying, "Violent, lots of fights, lots of glue huffing, dust, drinking, and oh yeah, fights." When the Stimulators came back from Ireland, Harley brought that skinhead culture with him and introduced it to the New York scene, building his own movement along the way. This was also around the time that hardcore punk started to blossom in New York City. Bands like Black Flag and Bad Brains were making punk music, but harder and faster and more aggressive, and that really spoke to a young Harley Flanagan. While he was in the Stimulators, Harley taught himself how to play bass, and he began writing his own songs. He kind of knew that his time in the Stimulators was coming to an end. He wanted to do something much different, and by writing his own songs and playing bass, he was building the foundation of what would become Cro-Mags. Before we get into the Cro-Mags, I want to give a little bit of a background on what the New York hardcore scene actually was. After the CBGB, Ramones, Blondie, Talking Heads era of punk kind of came to an end, it felt like New York pressed the pause button. As Denise, Harley's Stimulator aunt, said, quote, "There was no scene. We arrived after that television and Ramones thing. At least in my world, that wasn't really happening. I don't even know if those people were still out playing. That wasn't our world. It seemed like there was a pause and nothing was really happening," end quote. So during that period, the Stimulators and a couple other punk bands basically kept punk music afloat in New York. The Stimulators aren't talked about enough, I think. They really stepped into a void and kept that scene like that. They are that transition band between the early CBGB punk and the NYHC scene, and I think they deserve a lot more credit for that. So listen to the Stimulators, I guess. Thanks to Peter Crowley, who was booking the bands, Max's Kansas City became the punk center of New York City. Max's was losing a lot of money, but Peter didn't care. He wanted to bring in new and exciting music. He started a thing called Punk Thursdays, where all of these young punk bands could come perform. It was kind of the predecessor to the CBGB matinees that everyone talks about now. Max's gave these hardcore kids a home. Even if hardcore wasn't really a thing yet, it was pretty clear that there was something different about what these kids were doing and what the older punk heads were doing. As Uncle Al Morris, who was the guitarist in Murphy's Law among a host of other bands, said, quote, "What differentiated punk from hardcore was heroin. To be considered punk in 1980, it seemed you had to emulate the Junkies. To be hardcore meant you had to be healthy enough to rock the pit. Junkies just nodded out in the corner." Also, a bunch of New York kids would go down to Washington, D.C. to see the Stimulators play with bands like Bad Brains, and then Bad Brains would come to New York and bring a lot of D.C. fans with them, and through that, the D.C. scene really ignited hardcore in New York, and people might not like hearing me say that. I think there's that kind of weird rivalry between DC hardcore and New York hardcore. I think they didn't get along all that much at the end, but it's undeniable that those hardcore scenes in DC brought passion and energy and a new way of doing things into the New York scene. This burgeoning New York hardcore scene found a home at A7, which was a tiny club where members of the community worked the door and were bartenders, and where slam dancing and stage diving was essentially demanded. When A7 had to close, CBGB stepped into the void, and as they did with the first punk bands, they gave these new hardcore punk bands a place to play. They had these things called Sunday matinees, which were all ages, and that was where hardcore really found its legs and was given room to expand and grow and become something so much bigger. There's a whole video that can be made on the NYHC scene talking about Rat Cage Records and the importance of fanzines in the culture, but I'll save that for a different video. I just wanted to make sure that you had a general understanding of what the New York hardcore scene was, where it came from, what it came out of, before we talk about how Cro-Mags kind of burst into it and changed a lot of things about it. Harley Flanagan first met John Joseph around 1980 when he was still in the Stimulators, and John would come up from Washington, D.C. for hardcore shows. John was stationed in D.C. as a member of the Navy. John Joseph McGowan was born in 1962 in New York, and then stories differ on what happened next. He says his father was abusive and literally gambled away their house. He said he and his brother were the result of his father his mother twice after they had already broken up. He said, quote, "I came out of a very violent background as a child. My father was a well-known boxer and very violent towards my mom. I didn't find out until I was 40 years old that she had already left him, and he broke in and raped her, and that's how I was conceived." End quote. His mother struggled with addiction and was pretty neglectful because of that, so when he was 5 years old, he and his brother were removed from her care and placed in a foster home, which didn't sound much better. He said that they faced abuse, neglect, starvation, anything you could imagine for 7 years in that foster home. At 14, he ran away from his foster home and started living on the streets of New York, working as a drug mule and stealing just to survive. He said, quote, "I was in some of the worst places a juvenile at 16 could go." Eventually, he got arrested and spent 21 months at a juvenile facility. When he got out, his mother was dating a Navy recruiter who, quote, "offered me the Navy as opposed to possibly facing more jail time. So, as I always say, and my brother E says, the state didn't raise no fool, so we took the Navy." End quote. But despite joining the Navy, his behavior really didn't change. He said he was high on angel dust during boot camp. While in DC, he discovered Bad Brains and their concept of PMA, or positive mental attitude. Watch my Bad Brains video if you want more information about that. But he said that idea just completely changed his life. He eventually got in trouble with the Navy for smuggling drugs and assaulting someone with a paint can, so he decided it was best that he desert the Navy instead of facing whatever punishment they were about to throw at him. And he headed back to New York. I think it's worth noting that some people have questioned whether or not John exaggerated certain aspects of his childhood and how horrible it was. As Harley said, quote, "John says that he lived in all kinds of foster homes and foster care. Some of that is probably true. All I know is that when I met him, I went out to his mom's house in like 1980, and it was a nice apartment in Queens. It was bigger than where I live now or did then. It had pictures of him and his brothers all over the house like any family." Long before the band was a thing, Harley was already spreading around this idea of Cro-Mags. He kind of used it as a name for his little group of skinhead punks. He was tagging it everywhere, placing stickers on anyone he could find. So people kind of knew the phrase Cro-Mags, even if they didn't really know what it was. There's some people who say that Harley played in a version of Cro-Mags around this time that was called Disco Smoothie, but I'm not really going to get into that. This video is already long enough, and I don't know that I would count that as Cro-Mags. I mean, they weren't under the name. It was kind of different people in and out. It was proto-Cro-Mags. They developed a little bit of the sound that would become Cro-Mags, but I don't count the band as having started at this point. Before the band actually got going, Harley spent some time living out in California and then Canada, getting further and further into violence and drugs and drinking. Once he got back to New York in 1983, he finally started Cro-Mags, the band, as an official band. But again, stories differ a little bit depending on who you ask. Before Harley went to California and Canada, and Harley said he met Parris through his friend Paul, but Parris introduced himself as Kevin, and Harley said he had no idea his name was actually Parris until they were recording their first album as the Cro-Mags. But Parris claims that he met Harley in 1983, right around the time they started the band, and after Harley had come back to New York, when Parris was hanging up posters all around the Lower East Side and Avenue A area, asking people to audition for his band and trying to get a band together through these posters. So Parris says that Harley and his friend Paul were walking down the street and they saw those posters and they saw Parris, and Harley nudged his friend Paul and said, "You should join a band with this guy." And Paul said, "I can't play with Parris. I'm not good enough. He can play Rush songs." And Harley didn't necessarily like Rush, but he figured anyone who could play Rush could play his stuff, so they started hanging out and jamming a little bit together. Parris Mayhew was born in New York in 1964. His father, Aubrey, worked in the music industry as a producer and songwriter who had actually started his own labels, finding a little bit of success in the country market. Parris was always interested in music, so when he was 14, he asked his dad for a drum set. His dad gave him a guitar instead. Parris, in an act of rebellion, refused to play that guitar and instead asked for a bass, since he thought it would be easier to learn how to play since it had less strings, which kind of makes sense to me. Unlike other people, he said that he didn't learn how to play bass or guitar by playing along to the songs he loved. He said that he would write his own songs and that's all he would play. He said, quote, "I started my first band reported missing at age 14 with kids from my high school playing my original songs and trying our hardest to be like Rush. But then I heard Motorhead and I loved them just as much as the bands where only virtuosity reigned, like Rush and Van Halen, bands who played Madison Square Garden and were in all the magazines, which initially I had a hard time accepting. Motorhead completely warped my idea of what you had to be to make great music, and with that in mind, I began writing differently, more like myself." End quote. Paul, Harley's friend who kind of introduced them, was apparently there when Parris first discovered punk music. He said it happened when Paul brought him to the Mud Club and he heard a band playing the Sex Pistols, and he was just blown away by it. He said that after he met Paul and Harley, he went back to Harley's apartment to essentially audition, and he played a song called World Peace that he thought was his best song, and it would end up on their debut album. John Joseph claims that he was there at the very beginning, performing with the group as the original lead singer as a band called Modes of Ignorance, before he left to go to Puerto Rico for a bit and was replaced by Harley's friend Eric Casanova. But then Eric was going to have a kid, so his priorities kind of shifted and he wouldn't be able to go out on tour, so he was replaced by John, who was recently back in New York. Harley said that John got the gig because he was the most persistent and just kept asking about it. I will say that the NYHC scene was full of people starting and stopping and switching bands. I mean, Harley helped start Murphy's Law before moving on to Cro-Mags. There's just so much turnover and incestuous bands in this world that it's really hard to keep track of who all was in the bands at various points. Apparently Roger from Agnostic Front played bass in Cro-Mags at one point, and with all of the drugs and alcohol that was flowing through the scene, people's memories are a little spotty and stories differ. So instead of trying to get a super accurate account of these early days and these early lineups, I figured I would just focus on kind of the important players who were there for the long haul. To round out the band, Harley, John, and Parris turned to Mackie Jason on drums, who was in another band called Urban Blight. Even though he wasn't super into hardcore punk, he was a big Bad Brains fan. He was really into a lot of music, and at least according to Harley, was one of the best drummers around. Then they brought in Doug Holland on guitar, who was maybe the most experienced member outside of Harley. He had played in bands like Apprehended and Kraut, where he got to open for The Clash. Doug was originally from Queens, and he used to drive a bunch of kids from Queens into the Lower East Side to see the hardcore shows. So in January of 1986, this core group of Cro-Mags entered the studio to record their debut album. Released in 1986 on a small label called Profile, The Age of Quarrel became a classic in the hardcore scene. Cro-Mags were already establishing themselves as one of the best bands in the community, and this album perfectly encapsulated their sound for so many people. It came together so fast because the guys were really young, and they said they just went into the studio and blasted it out. It was full of energy and aggression and chaos and all of the things that defined Harley and John's life up until that point. Plus, Harley and Parris, who were kind of responsible for writing the entire album, depending on who you ask, sorry John, really worked well together, and they built a really good partnership. They clicked. The chemistry was great. As Parris said, quote, "Me and Harley started the band, we created the band, and we made the discoveries that defined the phenomenon. Harley was my partner in this." End quote. Harley did agree that he and Parris were the main songwriters, but he added, quote, "Honestly, I have to say that none of the songs would have sounded the way they wound up sounding if it had not been for a little bit of everybody." End quote. But As is typical with Cro-Mags, John has a different story. He said, quote, Mackie and I wrote the songs. I could go through every song on the record I wrote. From Age of Coral, there were maybe 3 songs I did not write, which doesn't seem true, but, I wasn't there, so who am I to say? They recorded it over the course of a couple weeks, all playing live in the same room with John, in a different room doing vocals. But John was sick, so Harley claims that John's voice on the album sounds nothing like how John sounded in real life. But that didn't stop the album from being a classic and inspiring so many different hardcore punk scenes around the world. While this album was coming out and Cro-Mags were establishing themselves as one of the most essential and respected hardcore bands in the scene, John got spiritual. John adopted Hare Krishna beliefs, eventually inspiring a whole bunch of other people in the scene to adopt them as well, including Harley, though that never stopped them from doing drugs and fighting and stealing and really doing anything at all that they wanted to do. Harley said, quote, the spiritual thing was attractive to people who were disillusioned with everything around them. It felt like here were some answers in an uncertain world. And then Cro-Mags took that next step up. They got a little bit more popularity than the rest of the hardcore punk bands, and that's because MTV picked up their music video for the song We Gotta Know. They were, I think, the first band from the N.Y.H.C scene that got airtime on MTV, and it opened them up to so many more opportunities. Despite that success, they were still touring in a van that routinely broke down and making next to no money, living in little squats, and that's largely because their manager, Chris Williamson, was either really bad at his job or just straight up cheating them, depending on who you ask. Chris set up a subsidiary of Profile Records, which was the record label that Cro-Mags signed with, called Rock Hotel Records, and he used that to start putting out the Cro-Mags music. So not only was he their manager, he was also their label owner, and that just doesn't sound like a good idea. Other bands that he worked with, like Leeway, talked about how dishonest he was with contracts. A lot of people seem to think he saw these naive rock bands in New York that were super young and super uneducated on the music business and were really excited to get any kind of industry attention, and he just exploited them and exploited their scene and their sound and their community. Though other people think that he really loved hardcore punk and he worked really hard to push the community forward. Cro-Mags, kind of continuing their upward trajectory, managed to get a spot opening for Motorhead on their tour, but right before that started, Mackie Jason quit the band and he was replaced by Pete Hines. As the band got bigger and bigger, tensions kept mounting, and the band went on a European tour with Motorhead in 1987 that proved to be the end of at least this iteration of Cro-Mags. John said that he was getting really fed up with the rock star attitude that had started to hang around the band. He said, quote, when the rock star attitude started kicking in with those guys, that's when I realized I didn't sign on for this. I'm not in here trying to be no rock star. It's about keeping it real with the people who are coming to see your shows and having a good time, end quote. After an issue with Doug and Harley stealing Chris Williamson's wallet and apparently stealing all of the money from the tour, John completely flipped out and left the tour and went back home. Harley claims that once they all got back home, John wanted back in the band and kind of expected to just be welcomed back in, but according to Harley, none of the other members wanted him back in, so John was kicked out of the band. Harley said, quote, the truth is everybody in that band we all got stiffed. That's a lot of the reason why everybody kind of started turning on each other. When you have nothing and you're getting ripped and robbed and over, it's like desperation makes people desperate. But Parris kind of implied that John was fired. He said that John was replaced when he proved to be inadequate. Parris claims that John was using his spiritual beliefs to manipulate people, and he was turning Harley and Parris against each other, but then John realized that spiritual manipulation would never work on Parris. Parris was never going to convert. Parris said, quote, I always thought of him as a prop, someone who fit the suit. There certainly would have been a Cro-Mags with or without John, no question. All that said, John could have worked out well in Cro-Mags as the singer, but he handicapped himself by not turning to the 2 musicians in the band who could have guided him to excel within his limitations, and of course, if he hadn't tried to sabotage my relationship with Harley. Parris also said that he and Harley would never recover from that rift that John put between them. With John out, the band started to move in a new direction, a decidedly metal direction. Parris and Doug were always big metalheads, big fans of metal music, so the sound started to drift into a metal punk fusion kind of thing, which was happening all over the New York hardcore scene at that point. During the recording of their second album, Doug was battling some pretty serious drug problems, so it was a really rough time for him. Their second album, Best Wishes, released in 1989 and kind of split the fan base. Some people loved the metal influence, but the diehard hardcore kids hated it. Harley took over the vocals on it, which further underscored just how different this album was to Age of Quarrel, which everyone loved. Doug wasn't quite able to get his drug issues under control, and he left the band soon after its release. As Harley said, quote, "I don't think we fired him. He just kind of faded out of the picture. He didn't want to gig or tour," end quote. They replaced him with Rob Buckley, who was much more of a metalhead without those hardcore roots, and he pushed them further into the metal direction, which Harley kind of grew to not like, but Parris always really enjoyed. The band was struggling to get out of their contract with Profile and Chris Williamson, something they knew they needed to do, but were told that they would have to pay off a $100,000 debt, which was just impossible since Profile and Chris never gave them any money. So in the midst of all of that, Parris approached Harley and said that he and Rob were leaving the band to do their own thing, and he suggested that Harley start making music under a different name. That way he wouldn't owe the Cro-Mags debt if he wasn't Cro-Mags. But Harley bristled against that. Cro-Mags was his baby. It was his thing. He couldn't just abandon it. Parris said about that decision to leave, quote, "Rob and I wanted nothing to do with him, much as Petey had decided after Best Wishes tour when he quit for the same reason. So we, Rob and I, decided to leave and start a new band with the music that we had written, our music." After a little bit of just kind of like floundering, Harley heard from a German record label called Century Media that they were really interested in putting out new Cro-Mags music, but they were mostly interested in getting together as much of the Age of Quarrel lineup as they possibly could. So Harley got in touch with John and Doug, and they both agreed to rejoin Cro-Mags. They released Alpha Omega in 1992, with Harley and John sharing vocal duties. But John and Harley will never get along, so John left again because of money disputes. He thought Harley was ripping the band off, but Harley said he never had access to the money. And while that relationship was breaking down and Harley refused to tour with John, Century Media took some leftover recordings that weren't used for Alpha Omega and made a new album out of them called Near Death Experience. That album was released in 1993, and Harley thinks it is terrible. He said he didn't give them permission to do that, but the band was on hiatus at that point, so what could he really do? After that band breakup, Harley entered into a dark period of serious drug addiction. He said that he entered a downward spiral where the drugs helped him stay in a state of depression. But eventually, Harley started to come out of that serious state of depression, and he and Parris started talking again. They agreed to resurrect the Cro-Mags, and together they released an album called Revenge in 2000, which Harley calls their best album, and they released it on their own label. But then everything exploded, as it always does. While on tour, Harley said that he saw a notebook that Parris always kept with him. In it was all kinds of insulting things that Parris wrote about Harley and the band. He also said that the notebook detailed business deals that Parris struck without Harley knowing or benefiting from them. But Parris basically always said that Harley was just a jerk who manipulated and used Parris to reestablish himself in the music scene. He said, quote, "I was foolish. He lured me with my own legacy and rode my music back into the real world of professional music. Then he revealed his true self, so I left again." Since that last split of the original members, things haven't exactly cooled off between them. Parris did play with Harley again in a band called White Devil, though Parris claims that Harley manipulated and begged him into joining that group. He always paints Harley as this drug-addicted egomaniac who uses and manipulates people into getting what he wants. These days, Parris is really focused on his own solo work and kind of refuses to have anything to do with Cro-Mags. When asked if any of his old Cro-Mags bandmates had said anything about his new work, he said, quote, "I don't have any contact with any of them. I did get an email. It doesn't take much to get Harley to say unkind things online," end quote. Famously, John and Harley's relationship might be one of the biggest feuds in punk history. John was touring under the name Cro-Mags JM with, I think, Mackie at one point, and Harley initially agreed that was okay, but then he sued John in order to bar him from using the name Cro-Mags at all, since it's Harley's copyright. John continues to claim that Harley stole from the band on several different tours, and then he recently claimed that Harley snitched on him to the Navy, letting the Navy know that he was AWOL, which got him to a whole host of legal trouble with the military. He also claims that Harley was very racist and was known to attack LGBTQ people when they were much younger. He said there was even a magazine warning the LGBTQ community to steer clear of Harley. Apparently, they were offered a ton ton of money to play shows in Europe, but John said, quote, "You couldn't pay me any amount of money to get back on stage with that guy," end quote. Kind of most infamously, Harley was arrested for attacking members of John's Cro-Mags at the CBGB festival in 2012. Harley claims he was there to try and bury the hatchet to see if John wanted to work together again, or at least just kind of reconcile their relationship, even if they didn't work together again. But then he claims he was set up and jumped when he was brought back into their dressing room, so he just started defending himself. But the band members claim that he came into their dressing room and attacked them with a knife. I think charges were eventually dropped on that when they couldn't find any witnesses who were willing to come forward and testify. That feud is really long and really storied. They still take occasional shots at each other on social media and in interviews, so you can fall into that rabbit hole if you want. I will say I kind of browsed some forums like Reddit and stuff to see who the general hardcore community agreed with, to see if maybe there was one side where everyone's just like, yeah, Harley is just a crazy drug addict, don't pay attention to him, or yeah, John does exaggerate and lie about everything, don't listen to him. And it sounds like there is no consensus. It sounds like it depends on kind of whoever is putting on the best shows at any given time. That's who the majority of people enjoy the most. So right now, I think everyone's behind Harley, but that could change in 2 years, who knows? But regardless, it feels highly unlikely that we will ever see a reunion of the Age of Quarrel Cro-Mags. And that's the abridged story of the Cro-Mags. There's a lot more that could be said about this group, about these relationships. Just wanted to hit the highlights. Let me know what I missed in the comments below, or let other people know what I missed in the comments below. Share your favorite stories of the Cro-Mags. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss out on more stories like this from music history.